Welcome everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Brokering Truces Between Gangs in Latin America, New Evidence on the Effects of Communities. I'm José Pinilla. I'm a policy manager at Innovations for Poverty Action, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Today's webinar is the third in our series on crime and violence in Latin America and the Caribbean, co-hosted by Innovations for Poverty Action, the Becker Friedman Institute at the University of Chicago, and Princeton University. Chris Blattman, Ramali E. Pearson Professor of Global Conflict Studies at the University of Chicago, Research Associate at NBER, and co-organizer of the webinar series, together with Micaela Sviatschi, will give a brief introduction on the webinar series and the motivation behind it. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks so much. So it was 40 degrees Fahrenheit in Chicago on Sunday, and today it's 83, which is why I decided to dress like I'm going to a luau. So we have to celebrate the little things here. Meek and I co-organized this series really because violence and organized crime and organized violence is probably the greatest development and security challenge in the Western Hemisphere, maybe the world. And it feels sometimes like the policy cupboard's bare. There's very few options. It also feels like we don't really understand the problem, and we often misunderstand it. And it's a field just full of unintended consequences and mistakes. And so this is an effort to sort of highlight, I think, some of the best work being done by practitioners and policymakers, and to try to bring and curate what we think is some of the best new evidence to a wider audience, and really to sort of stretch our imaginations about what kind of work can be done in the policy sphere, but also just in the learning sphere, like how we can actually tackle this problem as social scientists. So my good friend Mika, who's besides a coordinator, is co-organizer, is going to be one of the presenters today, and her colleague Eduardo Montero, who's at Basic University of Michigan, are going to talk about brokering truces. And as always, we have a policy commenter. This is today, I'm happy to introduce Noah Bullock, who's direct from El Salvador, who's a longtime human rights worker there, I think for almost 2 decades, and the executive director of an organization called Cristosal. Just, something that occurs to me why I'm so excited about this topic is I actually spent most of my career working on the problem of civil war in Africa, and came late to the issue of organized crime. And when you work in this sphere of international and civil conflicts, it's obvious that there's nothing more fundamental to conflict resolution and peace and security than negotiation. And there's no more noble sentiment and program than the idea of mediating that kind of peace. And a lot of the social science suggests that mediation works. Most of it's qualitative, but there's also some really clever work. One of my favorite examples comes from one of my former students and a close friend and colleague, Baron Baber, who looks at summer vacations. And you might think, well, how does European summer vacation, what does that have to do with peace? Well, it turns out, peace breaks out, truces break out all the time, every month between armed groups. And they're just as likely to sort of start talks in January as they are in July. But the thing is most mediators are coming from OECD countries, all of which are in the north, and they're often parliamentarians and high-level bureaucrats who are busy most of the year. And it's only in July and August, when things wind down, that they're more available. And so your probability of your talks getting mediated by some negotiator is much higher in the summer. And Baron goes to show that actually this is a much more, those talks seem to be more likely to lead to peace agreements, and those pieces tend to be more durable. And somehow though, when it comes to gangs, we forget that this is a really important role. And in fact, a lot of places criminalize this kind of brokering. It's true in Chicago, where I followed around people who are mediating conflicts. And to me, it's tragic that this is not only de-emphasized, but sometimes criminalized. It's a lot like our approach to terrorists. There's a mental barrier, partly principled, maybe strategic, but I think mostly blind, that stops us from understanding negotiating with people who use certain methods. And if you want to challenge that, I really recommend a book like Jonathan Powell, who is the chief negotiator on the British side with the Irish Republican Army, called Talking to Terrorists, who he later on became like a major negotiator, including of part of the peace and several peace agreements in Latin America. And I challenge you to look at that and see how you feel. I'd also challenge you to sort of think about the results and the talk today and how you feel. It's a complicated issue. We have to weigh a lot of complex strategic and factors and principles, but surely we also have to weigh the efficacy of this strategy. And I think that's really what we need more evidence on and why I'm so excited about the paper today. So with that, I'm going to introduce Mika and Eduardo.
Great. Let me share the screen. Thank you.
Sorry, Mika, before you begin, I will just give a few housekeeping notes.
Perfect.
So we will start with the presentation on Mika and Eduardo's research, and then it will be followed up by some policy implications comments by Noah. You can feel free to ask questions during the event using the Q&A option, and share your name and affiliation if you're comfortable doing so, so our panelists know who's asking the questions. Feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation, but we will probably only answer them at the end. And finally, I would like to mention that this webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to watch it afterwards, both in English and Spanish. So we appreciate you sharing the link with any colleagues that you think might be interested in these topics. También recordarles una vez más que contamos con traducción simultánea en español. Si necesitan ayuda con la traducción, activando la traducción, por favor pueden escribirnos también en la barra del Q&A. Okay, over to you, Mika. Thank you.
Great. So so basically this work that we are going to talk, it's based on this paper. It's a working paper on market structure and extortion. So we started this paper based on this big problem. We see that organized crime and associated extortion is very common in many countries. And extortion is mainly the main source of revenue for gangs, in particular in El Salvador. It is estimated about 70% of films pay extortion. So this is a kind of like super big issue in the area because this is one of the main business of gangs. So governments have attempted many strategies to limit the negative consequences of gang violence and extortion. And one particular common strategy, as Chris was mentioning before, was to try the government to broker a truce between gangs in order to reduce their competition, the competition for territory, and then violence. However, what we found out is that there was a lot of discussion about whether the brokering a truce could reduce violence or not, but there was little evidence on the effect of gang competition on extortion. And this is mainly because extortion is very difficult to measure. Very few people go and report extortion in this context. So in this project, what we are doing is first using new data from this wholesale distributor in El Salvador, which has the location and payment of about 50,000 extortion incidents. And we also link this data with sales data from the firm with revenue and cost for each product and retailer. And this is a map from all the places where the company does a delivery and is extorted. I'm going to provide more details in a bit. And the second thing that we are going to exploit here is actually it's not a truce per se, but it's something that came after a truce that was brokered by government, which is in 2016, there was this non-aggression pact between the two main gangs in El Salvador, Neighborhood 18 and MS-13. And the pact mainly prohibit invasion of other gangs into the rivals' territory and also violence target the members of rival gangs. And this was super huge. There was even a 12-member coordinated committee that continued to meet until nowadays to try to maintain this pact. In 2019, a gang representative said, at the present, we have a non-aggression pact between us. The idea being that boundaries will be respected. So what we want to understand is how did the pact allow the gangs to collude on extortion? So this is the period that we're going to focus, which is 2016, where we see this decline in homicides, and we're going to try to see what happens with the business of gangs, in this case, extortion. So as a preview of the research question and findings, the first thing is that we exploit this data to try to understand a bit how this extortion market works for gangs. And what we find is something that now it sounds like an obvious, that empirical evidence with price discrimination of gangs. Basically, gangs go and they charge a higher rate in locations where there is higher demand. In terms of the gang competition, what we find is that the non-aggression pact reduces competition and increased extortion by 20% in the areas that were affected. And then we ask, what are the downstream effects of extortion to consumers? And what we find is that there is this substantial pass-through. What we call pass-through is that basically the retailers that the distribution company distributes, they have an increase in their delivery costs. So basically they face an increase in cost due to this extortion. And what we see is that the result for the case of pharmaceuticals that are also distributed by this big firm, we see that the non-aggression pact increased their prices. We argue that this was likely due to the increase in extortion rates that came due to the pact. And as a result, we also see that hospital admissions for associated diseases, where we see the increase in prices, also increase. So let me give you a bit more of background about these guys. So as we know, El Salvador is one of these countries that is the most violent peace country in the world. We have about 103 per 100,000 population of homicide rate in 2015. And as I was mentioned before, this is largely due to these two gangs, which are MS-13 and Neighborhood 18, which had presence in the whole country. This is incredible. They have presence in almost all municipalities. For instance, this is a map from San Salvador, the city of El Salvador. And in blue and light blue, we can see all the areas that are under the control of gangs. If you can see, it's more or less like kind of like 50% of the territory is under control of these two gangs. And in previous work that I had with Nikita Melnikova and Carlos Schmidt-Padilla, we actually tried to understand whether there were like positive effects on development or not. And what we see is that the household income of individuals that live in gang control areas declines much more than individuals that just live 50 meters away. Here is the graph where you can see basically the distance to gang boundary. Here are all the people that live under gang territorial control. These are places which the gangs do not have territorial control, but maybe some presence. So this can be thought as a lower bound. And we see this big income. Even so, we have all these disparities that this gang generate. So in this project, we want to see, okay, what are the effects of extortion? So we know that there are negative effects on development. So what is the role of extortion and these non-aggression pacts? As I was saying before, much of this violence in El Salvador can be traced back to this main activity, which is extortion. Gangs basically fight between each other for territory to extort firms and business. And also they may use violence to collect extortion. And something important is that transportation and like buses and distribution firms like the one that we are going to talk today are often a target of extortion. So basically the gangs require trucks to pay extortion in order to do a delivery in a particular area. So every time they have to deliver, there's someone that stops and says like, okay, where are you going? And the trucks that have to deliver it in each area. And then they start charging this extortion. What is the failure to pay extortion? So the question when we start this, we thought more from the economic point, thinking that maybe the firm can decide whether to pay or not. And actually, it's not that much the case. So this is a newspaper report about like this bread, like it was a truck that was distributing bread in El Salvador, and basically the driver was stopped by a gang member and he decided not to pay la renta, the extortion payment, and this is what happened. The gang members set the truck on fire. So if you don't pay, like the threats can be very bad, like they can kill you. So in general, what people do is basically they don't distribute if the costs are too high, but it's not that they can decide whether to go and not pay. So that's not the case in this context. In terms of gang cooperation, as I was saying before, so before 2016, in 2012, there was an attempt, and this was actually, yes, a truce where the government basically sat down with all these gang leaders from these two main gangs, which were actually in jail, but from jail they coordinate all these different cliques that have around the country, and they sat down with them basically to negotiate a reduction in violence with the exchange of better conditions for gangs. And this is what we see here when we check the reported homicides. You see that in 2012, there was a huge decline, and this is something that appears in all the news. Everyone talk about this truce. It had, as Chris was mentioning before, with this truce, like basically didn't have that much popular support. So then it was broken, then homicides went again, but this kind of set out the grounds for these gangs to sit down together and start negotiating. For instance, one mechanism they used was through the church, and that continues. So what they said, like anecdotically, is that gang members still continue like meeting even after this truce was over. And in 2016, this culminated in this pact in April, where basically they coordinated not to invade each other's territory and not to kill others. So cooperation, basically, we can see here, at least like from this graph, that reduced violence in terms of homicides, and some others actually were speculating, okay, well, but gangs not only generate violence, they also extort and create all this threat to the population. So what happened with this. And this is what we are trying to see in this project. So Edu, I will let now Eduardo to continue with the data analysis, and we will see these results.
So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the data we use and some of the analysis. And so we use this data from a distributor on sales and extortion. So it seems pretty unique, but it's actually somewhat common for big firms in El Salvador to record all these extortion payments because it's such a common occurrence in their daily lives. So this firm gave us data from 2012, 2009 on both their sales and revenues and their extortion payments. So how does this work? This is a distributor firm that buys products either from abroad and then distributes them to local retailers. For distribution, the company actually subcontracts drivers and trucks. And in fact, actually to reduce extortion, these trucks are actually bear visible advertisement or company identification because they're kind of worried about being stopped. They're kind of trying to reduce, their visibility, which is a bit different than trucks in the US or other places which are very, full of advertisements. And also to reduce kind of the potential for violence and the negative consequences, they must leave and return to the warehouses at the end of each day. They're worried about these trucks being out overnight too long. And so this is pretty rich data, includes over 90,000 trips and 2.2 million deliveries. But I think the unique thing here is that it has a lot of data on extortion. And so how does extortion actually work for the distributor firm in particular? They have a robust security team that monitors the trucks, calls them, does regular check-ins, and is in charge of negotiating with the gangs. They don't want the drivers to be negotiating with the gangs. They want to have a third party here. This is another type of negotiation with gangs, partly to reduce kind of the potential negative consequences that Mika talked about earlier, where drivers refuse and get, trucks set on fire. And we found out actually this is a common approach in El Salvador for larger firms. And so how does these extortion payments actually work? So prior to actually making a delivery, so going to deliver products to a retailer in a gang controlled territory, the driver has to meet nearby to the delivery location with a gang representative who then collects extortion from them. How does this work in practice? So the truck driver stops, they call the security team, put the security team on with the gang representative, they sort of negotiate and confirm the amount, and then all three parties have to confirm the receipt of payment. In some cases, to reduce kind of this constant bargaining, which is just costly on its own, the extortion amount is sometimes pre-negotiated for a given period, sometimes bi-weekly, sometimes monthly, but we don't see that it's negotiated for longer than that actually. And so the security team actually emphasized that this is a really good system because it reduces fraud by the drivers potentially of them coming back and being like, oh, I had to pay a ton of money on extortion, can you reimburse me? But it also ensures the safety of drivers, which I think is the most essential part for the firm's perspective. And one thing to note is that the distributor has actually reported all this data and given it to the Attorney General's office. So they are reporting these extortion payments. It's just the Attorney General's office doesn't really have the capacity to do much about it. It's such a common problem. There's not much that has been done on this. And so this is what the data on extortion looks like across all of El Salvador when we kind of collect it all. So the data contains over 50,000 extortion payments between March 2012, when the firm started tracking all these extortion payments, and March 2019. As you can see, extortion is pretty widespread across El Salvador, and the extortion amounts vary a lot depending on the location. And of course, it's most concentrated in the larger cities of El Salvador. And individual extortion payments can be pretty small to pretty large. So on average, each extortion payment is about $7 per delivery, but it can range a lot. There's some cases where the firm reported paying up to $140. And so this might not seem like a lot of money from the US perspective or something, but it is a lot when we think about the distributor costs. So the average truck on a given day pays $14. That's roughly equal to half of the wage for the driver. So this is a considerable amount of money that goes to extortion from the firm's perspective. And so what we do is we combine this extortion data with their sales data, using a lot of information such as the route, the truck, and the location of the delivery to examine what determines extortion and the sort of extortion value. We don't necessarily understand super well. We set their extortion payments. And so we find a few things that I just want to talk about. This is descriptive, so just looking at correlations. to start. And so we find that extortion is actually increasing the delivery values, which makes sense. Gangs kind of look at how much is being delivered and then say, hey, you guys just delivered a lot of valued goods there. We should be able to charge you more. And so we see this positive relationship here between the value of goods being delivered and the extortion amount that gets charged to the firm. Something that's kind of interesting though is that we don't see a correlation between the total value that's left in the truck. So gangs normally, and this is what the firm confirmed, they don't look inside the truck and sort of do a complex calculation of how much is being delivered in other places to charge extortion. It seems like they really just focus on observables, like are they delivering to a very nice retailer or not, and how much is being delivered, rather than using the whole kind of route structure of the firm. When we look at the municipality level, what determines how much extortion is paid, we see something similar. We see that extortion is positively correlated with proxies for how much demand there is there. Again, consistent with price discrimination. So figure 5A looks at what's the correlation between nightlights as a proxy for development and the extortion amount paid in a year. We see that it's pretty positively correlated. And same with the total value that the firm delivers in a municipality, it's positively correlated with extortion. So it suggests that gangs are using this information to price in extortion, which is somewhat new evidence. We see that extortion is not a fixed fee. It's not $5 everywhere. It actually varies a lot depending on municipality characteristics and firm characteristics. So to summarize this, the descriptive analysis, gangs do price discriminate. They set it based on some of these observables. We also see that extortion is correlated both with economic development, but also gang violence and competition, because they're competing for more valuable areas and more valuable extortion territory. This means we can't really say is gang competition causing more extortion or not, because there's a lot of potential emitted variables, such as the development or demand of a region. And in fact, the causal effects could go in the opposite direction. And so what we do actually to try to get some new evidence on this of how gang competition or gang cooperation affects extortion is to look at this 2016 Non-Aggression Pact. Our empirical strategies, just very briefly, is was known as a difference in difference. The intuition is pretty simple. We're going to look at changes in extortion before and after the 2016 Non-Aggression Pact, which was pretty unexpected from the perspective of retailers, and compare areas where gangs were competing for territory to places where they were not competing. So that gives us kind of the difference in differences. And so how do we define what areas had gang competition? This is something somewhat tricky, but we kind of do the best we can here. So let me just explain what we do. We have very detailed data on homicides from the police, and the police actually try to determine the gang responsible for each homicide, if possible. And so the intuition for what is gang competition with this data is somewhat intuitive. It's both gangs commit homicides in an area. That implies to us that gangs are competing. So that's basically, in some sense, how we construct this measure of gang competition. We define kind of the share of homicides committed by each gang. And in places where both gangs are competing a lot, this share will be about half and half. And so we just define competition equal to 0 if there's only one gang committing a lot of the homicides and one otherwise. But we show in the paper, if you guys are interested, a lot of robustness to different measures of competition. But let's first start talking about how well are we kind of capturing gang competition. So here we're looking at homicides, but splitting it up into municipalities that have high gang competition and municipalities that have either low or no gang competition. And we see that actually following both packs, we see bigger drops in places with gang competition, which kind of validates this measure. We're kind of actually capturing some sense places with more gang competition. But we also see that municipalities are in similar trends prior to the Non-Aggression Pact, but then one type of municipality sees larger drops in their homicides. And we can see this in table form. So we find, looking at the police data, that the Non-Aggression Pact did lead to a 25% reduction in homicides. We also show in the paper, it's interesting, this Non-Aggression Pact reduces homicides or gang violence, but not general crime levels such as safety for citizens and other types of crimes. So it seems like this really affected gang violence, but not sort of crime levels overall for citizens. So now this is kind of our main result, which is what happens to extortion following this pact. So figure A is showing you just the raw trends in municipalities. So how much extortion was being charged in these places with competition in dark, without competition or low competition in lighter blue. And we see that prior to the non-aggression pact, these places were somewhat similar in terms of their extortion levels, but following the non-aggression pact, extortion went up much more in places with gang competition. So following the truce, these gangs were somewhat able to charge more extortion now to the firm. And this, in figure B, we show the effects by period, and it shows this increase over time. And so when we actually estimate this in table form to try to get the average effect that we find, we see that this collusion between gangs led to a 19% increase in extortion following the non-aggression pact. So pretty considerable increase in extortion. And again, we talked about earlier how gangs price discriminate. We look at whether places that have higher low development or population density see even larger increases in extortion. And that's what we find, that gangs increase the extortion most following this non-aggression pact, most in regions with higher kind of downstream demand. So they are acting kind of like economic agents trying to optimize where to charge more extortion. But we were interested, after we found this result in extortion, is, well, what happens to consumers? What are the downstream consequences of extortion? We provided evidence this affects firms and their costs going up, but naturally we would expect that to then affect consumers too. And so what are these downstream consequences, which we don't think are very well understood? And so what we did to try to get at this is we collected very detailed data on pharmacy sales, where we have information on all their sales and the prices charged for different goods. And pharmaceuticals are quite important because, in fact, El Salvador has one of the highest drug prices in Central America. People have talked about potentially this reduces access to drugs and affects health of the population. And it could be potentially to some of these additional costs due to gangs and gang extortion. And so we got this data from the government. And so when we look at what happens to pharmacy prices following the non-aggression pact, comparing places that had competition but were no longer competing to places that always had little to no competition, we find that gang collusion results in an 8% increase in retail prices for pharmaceuticals, just looking at all products. For drugs that like affect chronic conditions, we see that prices increase by 7%. So we see kind of this across the board increase in pharmaceutical prices following the non-aggression pact. And we think that this is likely due to extortion going up. The distributor firm, they do deliver to pharmaceuticals, they had to charge much more, they had to pay much more extortion. This was likely then ultimately passed through along the chain to consumers. Their prices got higher. And so what are the consequences of these higher prices? Well, if drug prices are higher, it might lead people to not be able to purchase as many drugs, and this could affect their health, of course. So we collected data on hospital admissions to public health facilities, and includes a lot of information, the location and the reasons for going to the hospital. And so we look at the health consequences of these gang non-aggression pacts, and we see that there's first no general increase in hospital admissions due to gang collusion, which makes sense. There's going to be some kind of contrasting effects. There might be less gang homicides, and it's not clear that the non-aggression pact and hospital or drug prices affect all types of admissions. But when we look at in the last two columns, chronic diagnoses that could be affected by drug adherence, so things like diabetes, where you have to be constantly taking medicine, or heart conditions for blood pressure, things like that, we see that hospital admissions did increase for these chronic conditions by 9%. So we're consistent with the increase in prices, and then this affects consumers. They can't purchase as many drugs that they need, and it affects their health ultimately. So just shedding light on both the effects on consumers in terms of prices and their health consequences, bringing to light additional consequences of these truces that have been a bit understudied because people often focus on reported homicides naturally as a first step. And so just to conclude, what do we think we're kind of doing in the study or contributing here to the debate on gang truces? We show that actually truces between gangs seem to allow them to increase extortion rates. They're not fighting for territory. That means that they're not spending as much resources kind of defending their territory, take up new territory, and kind of redirecting resources to increasing extortion on firms to increase their own revenues. And so we also show that this increase in extortion gets passed through to retailers. So firms now have higher costs, and then ultimately to consumers. Consumers now have higher prices, likely because of this chain, what economists call double marginalization. But ultimately, just consumers are bearing a large burden. And so we're highlighting an additional and understudied kind of consequence of gang truces. It's much more complicated than we think. I think people often focus on reported homicides, but what about extortion, consumer prices, firms? We're just trying to bring in more evidence on that. And additionally, providing some insights into how gangs operate as economic agents sometimes. And perhaps using these intuitions from economics can be helpful for trying to design anti-extortion policies. We're highlighting some goods are more affected by extortion than others. Perhaps we can, design more targeted policies. And that's something that we wanted to just highlight in this study. So that's all I have for here right now, and really looking forward to hearing what Noah has to say.
I'm going to start by thanking everyone for inviting me to be a part of this fascinating study and presentation. Congratulations to the investigation team. It's really a unique opportunity to be able to see a window into what we observe every day on the ground, but be able to verify a lot of those assumptions we make through data. And so I want to congratulate the team for identifying those data sets, whether it's from the institute that monitors the prices of medicine in El Salvador to the businesses that document almost in an audit report fashion the extortions. So I think it's tremendous what you've achieved to be able to describe using concrete data what many Salvadorans live and experience every day. I wanted to sort of start by talking a little bit about this window that you have opened up. It's obviously based on heavily looking at homicide data, a certain type of business, which would be the distributor, a large company that would come in to an area and deliver products. And sort of mention a couple things that might make our search for better understanding the impact of gangs in communities and the overall well-being of communities. Some of those things that go beyond the scope of this study would be, for example, other types of downstream extortions. The retailers themselves, are they paying another extortion on top of it? The other businesses that are present in the communities. We know that there's a systematic effort of gangs to usurp taxi companies, cooperatives, and other things like that. And also mobility. One of the things that we know in communities is where gangs exercise significant control. There's both a limited mobility for people to go out and have access to other services and goods, which could have an impact on demand, as well as the restriction of access means that specialized services, whether they're carpenters or metal workers or whatever it would be that would need to come into a territory, are often unable to. So that has an impact in the ability to develop businesses or the general local economy. And I also wanted to highlight that in terms of, it was seen, I think, in the study that control of territory was related to extortion on itself. But also I think opens up other areas for gang activity. The gangs themselves, their economic livelihood is extortion, but that's not the limitation of their activities. In communities, you often hear, especially from women, that gangs control territory, but they also control our bodies. So there are other elements that obviously beyond the scope of this that generate those impacts. And also, I think that we need to remember that violence itself, it was managed in the report a little bit as something that implies a cost for the gangs. And when that cost is eliminated, they can therefore dedicate themselves more thoroughly to extortion. But violence also has a capital for the gangs. That's one of the things that has been learned, is that it specifically has political capital. And using violence, wielding violence can generate benefits for the gangs. And that's what we see when the states themselves or politicians try and make agreements with gangs, both to reduce violence, but to have political access to territories. And so with that, I wanted to kind of make a summary that I think is one of the things that's really beautiful in the report, is how we also can see through the data an evolution of the gangs themselves. So when the gangs were first formed, I remember having a conversation with someone who said, I asked, what is the razón de ser? What's the razón de estar, right? The reason for being of the gangs when they were formed. And the response was this competition, rivalry with the other gang. And that was sort of the origin of it. And very quickly in the 90s, when the Salvadoran state declares kind of a war on gangs, that opens up another sort of rivalry and conflict with the state. And so you have simultaneously two conflicts that happen. The internal conflicts with the gangs themselves and the conflict with the state. And in the secession that you see in the 2012 truce, and then later the non-aggression pact, you can see how the gangs evolved around those two conflicts. In the first sense, in 2012, you have the state facilitating a truce in exchange for homicide reductions, political access, and then benefits for the gangs. And then 2012 or 16, you see the gangs negotiating among themselves to create sort of that distribution of the market. So the point that I wanted to make is that the gangs go from their origin of being, their reason for being is the rivalry itself, the competition, to later evolving into more economic motives that you have all described in the report, where they said, wait a second, the competition is actually a detractor to our ability to become an economic illegal enterprise. But at the same time, there's always a conflict with the state. And what we know in El Salvador is that in 2014, 15, 16, 17, the state strategy to the gangs was one of war, one of mass incarceration, torture, conditions analogous to torture in the prisons, extrajudicial killings, and abuse documented in communities that had an impact on the gangs. It was exhausting. And so the gangs have both, they both are exhausted by a conflict with themselves and a conflict with the state. And so in 2016, when they begin to sort of divvy up the market, like you said, they still had a state that was in a high level of repressive action against them. And so I think what you see now are indicators of a second type of agreement, one with the state itself, and where the state sees the gangs, homicide is always the most important political issue. If we can make sure that the gangs, from the perspective of the state, continue to reduce homicide and guarantee exclusive access for a political party to territories, the state then could offer to reduce the exhausting measures against them in the communities. So that's to say that there's multiple strains of conflict and negotiation going on at the same time. And the gangs themselves are more than just economic elements. They're political elements, and they negotiate that political power with the state. And they exercise control over more than just territories. They control people and mobility. And those are important things to remember. In terms of policy, I see three policy areas that are really important to look at. One is migration policy. The second one would be obviously security policy, and then local development and violence prevention policies. So I'll try and make some comments around those three areas and based on what we see in some of the research. And like I said at the outset, I think the research sort of backs a lot of some of the assumptions that we have been making based on other work in the region, especially around migration policy. Our organization, Cristosal, has been working specifically on the issue of internal displacement by violence since 2014. And one of the things that we see is during those truce periods, internal displacement by violence or gang-driven displacement does not subside. Actually, in the first truce period is when we saw the first really increase in internal displacement by gangs. And what we assume by that is that when the gangs are able to consolidate sort of their control over territories, making it clear that they turn the homicide or violence switch on and off, and maybe even the way that they're able to consolidate power over their extortion rackets, was a message to the population themselves that it wasn't the state that makes a decision about security, it's the gangs controlling territory, and therefore displacement went up. And the same thing was true in 2016. The first time we see a reduction in displacement really since 2012 was this year with the pandemic. So we've been at the estimates in El Salvador about internal displacement have been in the last 3 years at about 5% of the population reporting that they were internally displaced by violence. And then last year it was reduced to 2.1, which is still a significant number. So when we relate that to migration policy, one of the things that we have to think about is that homicide is not the only indicator for security. That's not how people are measuring their own security. And therefore, when homicides are reduced, it doesn't necessarily mean that people stop fleeing. And secondly, we've been trying to make an argument for a long time that the causes of migration, or better said, it's not helpful to make sort of a category, a hierarchy of causality for migration when we know it's interconnected. The economic causes, the security causes, the rule of law issues, the family reunification all become interconnected in this effort by people to live in areas controlled by criminal groups, to live in areas where the state's primary presence is repressive, and to survive using the family networks that are available to them. So what I think in the report, what we see is that true interconnectivity revealed in the data, that the ability to access healthcare, the ability even to run a business or buy your basic goods is directly affected by something much more complex. So your economic causes for migration are therefore deeply interconnected with the security causes, which has an implication for international protection. In 2014, I think it was, or 15, the UNHCR actually produced a report that applied the Refugee Convention standards to the Salvadoran conflict, or to the gangs, the gang violence in the region, to try and help make the argument in an asylum claim that, for example, resisting extortion in a territory is an act of political opposition. If the gangs themselves control territory, they control people, they control the local economies to some degree, then resisting that control in itself is an act of political opposition, and therefore grounds for protection. So there's interesting, the data, the way that it develops this interconnectivity between causality and shows the control that gangs have and influence that the gangs have on people's livelihoods, I think does force us all to look at migration and immigration itself. What are people fleeing, and what are the state's responsibility to those people in this type of a non-conventional conflict? In terms of, and also in terms of thinking about reintegration of returnee policy. If what we're doing is we're saying that people are fleeing only because of economic reasons, but not seeing that the economies are undermined by criminal groups, vocational training, access to credit won't solve that underlying problem that people are trying to survive in economies that are controlled by illicit groups. In terms of security policy, I think that it comes out really clearly in the report that homicide reduction, it does not correlate to necessarily more security for people. You see that the gangs, when in moments of truces, kill themselves less, but are able to dedicate their resources to other forms of illegal activity and control in territories. And that, again, goes back to that correlation with internal displacement during truce periods, but also a recent report in El Salvador about disappearances. It came out that more clandestine cemeteries have been found and attributed to the periods when there were gang truces than periods when there were more open competition, as they say in this report. And so what's not clear necessarily during these periods where we assume competition is going down because we see less homicide, as it's been isolated in the report, between gangs. We don't know necessarily who is being disappeared. We don't necessarily know the motives of the disappearances, but we're talking about thousands of people a year. And so I think that also opens up, again, this idea about the politics of violence itself. Obviously, visibly hiding homicide behind disappearances is a way for the gangs to continue to exert control and intimidation, while also potentially complying with other agreements they may have made with political actors. The other part with the security policy is when these secretive truces become state policy. I think what we can see, especially in your report, is that that doesn't weaken the gang structure. It mutates it, it evolves it. And so what's really important is for negotiation to be transparent. I think that at the outset, Chris made a really good point about negotiation. We've said this for a long time in El Salvador. Everybody almost daily has to negotiate some part of their lives with the criminal organizations that control the territories that we go through. But the act of being intermediary, negotiating for peace, is in fact criminalized by two laws in El Salvador. One, the anti-terror law, and the ruling of the Supreme Court that created the figure of what we call apologists to terrorists, and the Proscription of Gangs Act, what makes it illegal to be involved with a gang or to be a part of one or interact with it. So the fact that you see in this report a very formal negotiation between a business, an international business, and very local gangs show that negotiations are happening. And for the business, it's a way that they are trying to reduce the impacts of gang activity on their own business. They actually transfer those or externalize those costs back to the local community in the form of a retail price. And so I think that what this says to us is that there needs to be avenues for legal negotiation, transparent strategies in which gangs and gang members themselves are able to transition out of this cycle of extortion as a way of life. We need to have a reversal of three specific laws. One is the emergency laws in the prisons, which allow for basically a permanent state of emergency in the prisons, which means lockdowns of populations who haven't left their cells for 5 years. But in that lack of transparency in the prison, there is also an opening for illegal and non-transparent negotiations. We also need to have a rehabilitation law and reintegration law that helps people who have served their criminal sentences effectively not be persecuted by the law, and therefore to be able to renounce criminal activities. And I think we also need to recognize the politics of violence itself. It's expedient to go and get the quick response to get gangs to reduce homicide, but much more costly politically to move a country to a peace process. At the sort of local level and violence prevention level, we've been saying for a long time what I've already mentioned, that everybody is negotiating all the time, especially in communities, with gangs to solve problems. Whether it's to be able to introduce electricity into the community, water, or whatever it would be in the basic needs of a community's life, most of the time gangs have some influence over those activities. So being able to recognize those processes are already happening and bringing those forward in a more formal mediation way, I think is an important element of community and local development. How do we transform the conflict, recognizing that these are not alien invaders in communities, oftentimes they're family members and parts of the community, which represents, I think, an opportunity to try and transform the nature of the conflict. So I think that those would be kind of my responses. I know it was a bit dispersed, but again, I think it's really refreshing to be able to see the systematized data that you present reaffirming realities lived and the difficulties that they are. So thank you again for letting me be a part of this, and hopefully we can answer some questions.
Great. Thank you, Noah, for your comments. Yeah, we will now jump into the Q&A portion of the webinar. One of the first questions I would like to start with is on some of the other ways we could try to address some of these other effects of gun control, like the extortion, the economic coercion, that we could try without losing the benefits of the reduction in violence. So I don't know if Mica, Eduardo, if you have any comments on the kind of interventions or programming that might be used to address these problems.
So we don't know any other like program like to address this, but I think what Noah just mentioned about this putting like in a legal format setting, because what happened before, for example, this is a pact between the gangs. Still, we don't know if the government is involved or not because there is no transparency in that process. We do know that in 2015 there was 2012, sorry, there was this truce that was backed by government, but again under secrecy, and that was not supported by the population. So there hasn't been a try about like doing this transparently. So that's why maybe it's a way of moving forward. And actually, I wanted to ask you, Noah, about what do you think if this process would be transparent, would it have more popular support, like this type of policy? Because my sense of when I was in the field in El Salvador is it was a bit divided about what people thought about this of negotiating with gangs, even if it was like in a transparent way. Even if it was like the church involved and yeah, other actors.
Yeah, I think that's why the politics of violence is such an important thing to understand. Specifically, the current government has made a huge effort to position the gangs as this public enemy number one. The most serious security threat that faces the Salvadoran people are the teenagers in the community that are organized in gangs, and you see this systematic effort to criminalize and stigmatize the image of a gang, that makes it so there's very little space right now, I think, for people to feel open to a peace process. But I don't think that that's unique to El Salvador. What was required is political leadership that's willing to move a country to a different position. To be able, I think what we need to see are sort of transitional justice approaches where gang members are able to come forward and sort of truth commissions become part of reparations programs. And I think justice needs to be in some ways looked at from on a scaled basis. Who are the gang leaders who order terrible actions, and what do you do with minors who can't consent to those criminal actions themselves? So I think that there needs to be a scaling back of the criminalization of the gang itself, of the people, and leadership to be able to move the country to a more transparent peace process. And right now, that one of the biggest problems for former members of the gangs is that they can't effectively they can't stop being a crime because of the prescription of the Gangs Act. The state does not, even if they desist in their criminal activities, the state doesn't in persecuting them. The mere membership of a gang is 7 years in prison.
Thank you, Noah.
Thank you, Noah. Another question we have is on the degree to which we can generalize these findings to maybe other settings. So I was wondering if you might be able to comment how applicable you think these findings might be to other contexts in Latin America.
I think it can be like, I think on this Chris can like talk a bit more, like, of course, in the setting of Medellin, it's not only extortion, but at some point they would do extortion. And what we think is that when gangs like pact or like they as Noah was saying, and Chris is like, they reduce, like they move the resources that were before they were fighting to do other activities. So it's not the only violence, it's not the only cost that these gangs have in communities. In this case, we highlight the extortion, but we don't know if they would be doing also, I don't know, drug trafficking or other business, maybe also those could be affected. And I think that this maybe is like the most extreme example, because here what we are having is that gangs have like a lot, as Noah was mentioning before, a lot of territorial control, which I feel like it's a very extreme case of what these gangs do, that they're maybe predatory and do mostly extortion, but still they could have external validity for other contexts. For instance, these same gangs are present in Honduras, Guatemala, like exactly the neighborhood 18 and 13.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mika, for your comments. So we're running out of time. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but I was wondering if anyone had any final comments or reflections.
No, I think there was a question of Angelica that she was asking that, that I was seeing here in the chat that I wanted to mention. That's something that we don't see in this case, but mainly it's because only we are seeing only one distribution company, that she was asking whether we see an increase in the extensive margin, whether now they start extorting, having like more extortion payments. We don't see that's the case. But again, like here, we are not something that where we don't have, like, I think the external validity is that we couldn't check what happens in those businesses that are outside of our sample. Like informal businesses, we are not seeing the extortion rate. Maybe those is much higher than for these companies that still can have more leverage to negotiate. So I think that's one final comment that I want to make about our project and the limitations.
Great.
Thank you, Mika. Oh, go ahead, Eduardo.
Oh, I was just gonna say thank you to Noah, and like I think those were incredible thoughts. I think I think the way he's put it is very nice. Like we're shedding light on like just extortion and some prices on like for pharmaceuticals and health outcomes. But as Noah said, this is so interconnected. It's quite complicated. There's things to understand, like for internal displacement, disappearances. And so hopefully, yeah, we just keep all those things in mind, that we still need to understand these consequences and shed more light on them. So thank you for the awesome comments.